Good afternoon, everybody, once again. For those of you joining again from our benefits webinar or benefits session that we had just completed. As Haley had introduced there, we have myself, Connor Quinn. I work directly with Criterion in a partner success manager role. So that means I work really closely with the BAASS team here on their projects and their maintenance in both implementation and support of Criterion. And I'll throw it over to Nancy to introduce herself as well.
That's great, Connor. If you want to just share that PowerPoint.
Yes.
And I'm Nancy Pierce. I was on the first session with Steve and also just did the HRMS workshop on the second session. Our agenda for today, if we just want to move on to the next one, we're going to be, talking about these items. But basically, if you're tired of disparate systems managing scheduling, time collection, time off, timesheets, and payroll, this session, you're going to see how Criterion can manage all of those functions in one system while it seamlessly utilizes the data held in HR. So getting across the point even more that it's all one system. And if you do want to keep any of those systems, we're going to talk about integration in a few minutes. We talked about time off, or Connor talked about time off in the previous session. Now you're going to see how that ties into all of these other components. And if you're managing payroll for different companies or different countries in separate systems, you'll be happy to know that Criterion handles it all with one login and one database. Before we proceed, I'd just like to remind you that all attendees will be in listen-only mode, but please post your questions during the session and respond at the end. And I'm now going to hand it over to Connor to give you a brief introduction to Criterion in case you didn't attend our first session or previous sessions.
Excellent. Thank you, Nancy. Yep. So in this section here, you'll notice there's a very familiar little poster that we've been covering throughout the day here today. In our previous session leading up to this, we covered our HR and employee management area. Again, we're looking at an administrator functionality in this session, as opposed to ESS and some employee views from our earlier sessions. So what we're going to talk about and cover here are a couple of different items around both multi-state, multi-country, as Nancy had mentioned there. So we can run payroll across both United States and Canada within the same instance. We have a couple of more US specific ones we won't get into necessarily here today, but I have worked a lot with union clients and union-based contractors out in Canada as well. So we definitely have an applicable resource there that we can follow up with additional information. We'll talk about, as Nancy mentioned, our general ledger and how that feeds into certain integration points and what systems we can connect to from payroll. But really what we're going to look at too is we're going to look at scheduling, time collection, and how that all sort of feeds into payroll. So we're going to look at a couple areas of the system for scheduling, looking at time collection, time entry. We'll talk a little bit about the different methods by which we can collect time. We're not going to necessarily show them all, but we'll mention to you what they are and how they interact together. And then we're going to get into a little bit of a payroll batch, probably one that's already been completed, just to give you a sense of how that all works together.
Great, and just a reminder, if you're first time joining to find out about Criterion, it's a company that's been around for over 35 years in HR and payroll software development. It's a single unified database and it's cloud-based, and it's for those customers who are in Canada, their data is hosted in Canada. It's fully configurable to address each of your unique requirements, and just a full robust HCM system.
Excellent.
Yeah. So basically, if you just want to show the slide on the time collection or timekeeping options. So Criterion offers various methods to collect time worked by employees. You could just go to the next slide there, Connor, and then we've got a nice graphic there. That's great, thanks. Your organization may select one or more of these options and use different methods for different types of employees. So if your company currently uses time clocks for employees to punch in and out, Criterion offers terminals that support finger and badge swipe methods. That time is then reported on a timesheet for approval and then flows into Criterion's payroll or the payroll of your choice. For those employees who are not in the same physical location as a clock, but you still want them to punch in and out, there's the mobile method where they can punch in and out on their smartphone. Criterion supports geofencing in that situation, where it's the ability to draw a fence basically around each of your work locations using a map. It's super cool. This will monitor if the employee is punching in within the fence of that location or not, and the managers will be notified if they're outside of the fence. So if it's not a requirement for your employees to punch in and out for accurate time collection, timesheets then would be used, and there's various formats, various methods for them to populate their time, including entering a start and stop time for each day. So it's like a little bit of a punch in a sense, or you could just they could say I started at 9, ended at 5. They can enter the total time worked, 7.5 hours or 8 hours. They can enter time to departments or projects using either of those other two methods I just talked about, and also for punching as well. And employees don't need to allocate their time to various areas that they've worked during the standard workday. You can set up work periods, or scheduled time can be then automatically populated to the timesheet. And then, of course, if they had any approved time off, that would show there as well, and they could just amend as needed. I also mentioned that overtime rules and lunch breaks can be automated. And then let's go on and talk about integration on that next slide. So perhaps you've already got software that you'd like to keep because it manages those components well, or it's specific to your industry. If your payroll, for example, is in Sage 300, I know this was a question on an earlier session. If that's working well for you, we have an integration that can bring the common employee data from Criterion HCM into the payroll employee profiles in Sage 300. This is managed by the payroll administrator, who has complete control of what they pull, of when they pull that data in. They review the data changes and prior to updating the payroll data. If you're augmenting your Sage 300 payroll by using one of the time collection methods in Criterion, then we bring in the approved timesheet data from Criterion into Sage 300 timesheets for payroll processing. If you're using Manusonic for time collection, Manusonic offers an integration to CriterionHCM data for common employee data. They'll pull up that data into Manusonic, whether it be name, employee ID, department, all those things that you need. If you use Criterion Payroll, the time collected in Manusonic can then be uploaded into a payroll batch. If you use Sage Intacct, Criterion can pass the general ledger journal entry based on initiation by the Criterion payroll administrator once they've done payroll and they reviewed that data in an Excel report. That can just be pushed right up to Sage Intacct. And it's the same as if you're using Sage 300 for finance, but prefer to use Criterion for payroll. We can also do that journal entry, and that comes right with the system. Criterion is open API, so as long as your other systems are also open API, then an integration can be developed to pass information between applications. BAASS's development team are experts at system integration. They're familiar with Criterion system and tables, and they can work with you to scope custom integration with any of your other existing systems. So at this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Connor. He's going to show you a high-level review of the flow of data from approved time off, scheduling, time collection, timesheets, payroll, and general ledger.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nancy. And I'm going to bring my screen back to life here, and we should see back into employee self-service. So give me 1 second. All right. So we now should be viewing a similar screen to those who attended the first session here around employee self-service. So in employee self-service, again, this will be the access that each employee with a sign-in to Criterion has, with differentiation based off of their security profiles. So there's a few things that we have listed out to cover here. The first one is scheduling. So our scheduling module within Criterion is a part of what's called our payroll module, which would include the timekeeping as well. So Nancy mentioned for us our time clocks. So time clocks and scheduling would be a piece together. And what you can see here is I've created what's called our sample shift. So within Criterion, what we set up is a broad definition of the shift with the different schedules within that shift. So it may be first shift, second shift, and third shift. And then what you then do is actually assign employees to those shifts here. So the shift assignments, and you can see here, I have our sample shift period going through from September through the most recent period. So this sample shift, what it does is it creates the record for our employees and what they're actually scheduled to be working. So you can see we have 3 employees on shift A, shift B, and shift C. So if you were with us on the first session or the benefit session, you're familiar with our friend Edgar here. So Edgar is assigned to, in this coming up week, so this week that we're in right now, he's assigned to the Sunday and Saturday shift. So if we want to create the next week's shift as well, we hit this Add Shift Assignment button up at the top, and we'll choose our same shift period. And we can choose a few different ways in order to actually create this. We'll choose first our date. If we choose a different date, it'll ask us or prompt us to say, hey, you're creating a gap. Do you want to create a gap? We say no, because we want to make sure we create the schedule for that next week. We go to the 13th, and instead of create blank, which will just create us a new shift based off of the template up here, we're going to choose what's called rotate. Rotate will actually move our employees through those different shift periods. And now what you'll see is that Edgar has moved up to shift A. So now he's on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And you can see here from our first session, we recorded and approved time off for Edgar. So you can see that he has time off on a day that he's actually also scheduled to work. So from here, we're going to show you what the actual view would look like for Edgar. So here we are. This is his actual time off, which we saw in our first session. Edgar had submitted and was approved by our friend Thomas Rogers. Now for Edgar, he can see my shift assignments out of employee self-service here. We're just going to refresh this. And give it a second to just load up. And this will show Edgar what he's actually scheduled to be working. So here, from 12/6 to 12/12, we're going to move up to the 12/13. So you can see we have shift A, so the name of the shift and the time that he's scheduled to work, which you can see the details on by clicking into. And if we go back previous weeks, you can see how this rotates. So here he is for shift C in the week prior, and the week before that he was on shift B. So it goes from A to B to C. You can name those shifts whatever you'd like. And then from a management perspective, if you'd like to actually review what those shifts are, we do have, from a manager perspective, something called team availability or team attendance to show how those employees recorded against those specific shift assignments that were created for them. Okay. So from shifts, the employee would then record time. So for Edgar, in this case, if we go back to him and his timesheet, so we're going to work from the timesheet period that relates to 12/13 to 12/19. And again, you can see on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, he's scheduled from 8 to 4. So we're going to actually go enter in some time for Edgar from 8 to 4 on Monday and Wednesday to show you how that will compare against the shifts themselves. And again, he does have an approved time off that is on Friday here. So for Edgar, to tie this into our timesheets, he would go to My Timesheets. I'm going to talk about the different functionality out of here in just a moment for team timesheets. But so Edgar, he would look at his view from My Timesheets. What he can see is here are all the timesheets he's created so far, and he can see a status here. So clearly he hasn't submitted one in a while here. So we're going to click into the 12/13 to 12/19. And we know that he's scheduled to work Monday, Wednesday, but Friday, he's already put in some time off. And you can see it's representing a total of 8 hours, which was from his request. So as Nancy mentioned, we're looking at the tie together of all these different pieces and how they all feed in order to create or pull into our payroll batch. So this is one example here where we created, submitted a time off, and it was approved and added to our timesheet for us for Edgar. So he submitted it for the 18th, and it was added there. So we're going to add time on Monday, and we're going to also add time on Wednesday. And now what you can see here is a few things that get pre-populated for us based off of his default work location, which is the Toronto office. And he also has his position defaulted for him as well. In addition to that, he does have his wages, his pay code auto-populated here. So these are some fields that will specifically populate for us. And what you would have noticed in the PowerPoint is a more expanded list of fields. So we do support up to 9 different fields that you can track attributes about that time for. You see here we have pay code, location, and position. We also support project task, work location, what's called a work area, so something underneath that work location, as well as 4 custom fields. Those custom fields, in some cases, depending on if you are using one of the ERPs that Nancy would have already discussed, those custom fields may be tied out to specific fields in the ERP system that we need to track for you to send over for your financial data. But they also may just be something you want to track. So maybe it's a notes field and you want employees to put notes about their time. So you can put a free form custom field That's a text field for the employee on their timesheet. So what we're going to do here is we're going to record time, and on Monday, we're going to record it from 8 to 4, which matches up with our employee's shift. Now, again, I'm manually changing these in and out here. However, an employee can be punching in or out from their mobile app. They can be punching in or out from their timesheet, and they can also be punching in or out from the timesheet itself and from the web UI here, where they can hit this in button. They can also hit the plus button to start time, so they can enter in their actual time, or they can also hit start for in or out, depending on if they're punched in or punched out. Now this is next week, which is why we don't have the option to hit the in button on the timesheet we're looking at here. So what I want to show you though, is that when we enter this time, how it's gonna look from a manager perspective. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna enter this one from 9 to 5 instead, and show you what that'll look like from an availability or a scheduling perspective. Now for this employee, they have a few options here. If they wanna keep editing their timesheet, they can just hit save, or they can hit save and close out of their timesheet. There's also our submit button, which we'll come back to in just a moment. So for Thomas Rogers then, what we're gonna do is we're gonna navigate over to team availability, and it should come up in just a second here. Sorry, team attendance. Okay, and we're gonna choose cancel the specific day and our specific shift. And let that load for a second. Oops. Come back to that in just a moment. But from Edgar's perspective here, from the timesheet, when he's satisfied with his time that he entered in, what he can then do is choose to submit that timesheet. So again, we're a week ahead, but that's all right for our purposes. So we'll submit this timesheet. This is an optional setup on the timesheet and the workflow itself, where we can allow an employee or require that an employee provide a signature with their timesheet submission, basically saying, I confirm that these hours are correct. Maybe you say something like, I took all of my breaks and I didn't get hurt, or there was no issues or injuries on the site. So then they can sign it in here as well. Again, you can clear that out if you're not happy with the signature and hit submit. Now that submission will then route, again, based off of the workflow itself, to either the employee's manager or to the specific employee in that case as well. So here, if we go back, and we'll see now timesheet submission for Edgar Fallon. And it responds to the period that we were just looking at. You can see the hourly wages, and vacation as well. So here's the entries, and here's what we just looked at. Now we're asked to approve or reject, and we'll just hit approve. We'll say yes. And then once that's approved, this timesheet will be available to pull into our actual payroll batch. So I do have a payroll batch previously created for us, which has been calculated for being paid. So in this case, we're going to click over into payroll, where we have our BAASS batch that has been created, corresponds to the same period we were just looking at for 12/13 to 12/19. There we hit next, and we'll see some employees which have already been added into this. And we're also going to add our friend Edgar Fallon, who we just entered our time for. And the process from here to actually bring in Edgar's time, relatively straightforward. Use this import button, and we're going to hit load timesheets. And you'll see 3 records. So if you recall from Edgar, we had 3 rows. We had his regular Monday, regular Wednesday, and his vacation for Friday. So we click our checkbox and hit add to batch. That will add our hours for Edgar. And once we calculate, he should have his information pull in. And it does. And he's got his pay. So simple as that to load timesheets. You can see here we have hourly 16, where we entered 8 to 4 and 9 to 5 for a total of 16 hours. We also then have his PTO time, which was brought in. What you also notice is we didn't have to manage our incomes there. By virtue of just loading our timesheet, it adds the incomes that are relevant for that employee. So we already added things like salary and hourly as well. But for Edgar, that previous income of PTO had not been there, and it was added to the batch for us by virtue of loading the timesheet. When we hit next, we'll get our summary in this case, where you get a breakdown of the incomes paid in the batch. You get a breakdown of the taxes, both on the employee and employer side, so employer taxes and employee taxes, as well as deductions as well, giving you an overall total for the batch. So when we talk about the GL entries for payroll, what we're looking for when we send it over to whether it's Sage product or some other ERP, the total that Criterion will send over and what will be tied out as a part of the general ledger configured in Criterion is our payroll total. Payroll total is representative of the gross income plus employer taxes plus employer deductions. To move this batch to be paid, you would approve it, and it would then be available for you under pay processing. Under pay processing, we support a number of formats for the major banks across Canada. If you do have unique file formats or maybe work with a bank that's not one of the larger banks, we do have the ability to create those files for you as well. And you can see here we have our BAASS batch, which is going to be a very, very similar summary here for what we saw in the payroll approval screen, where our payroll total amount is going to match up right here. Now, again, you'll see a breakdown of who's getting paid and where that pay is going. So are we sending checks? Are we sending EFT payments? And what are those amounts? So this gives you a good breakdown and a summarization of what you're looking at. So what's going to go out in your EFT file and what are you going to be cutting in terms of checks? Now, if you do generate checks through Criterion, you will get a check reference number. And that reference number will be stored along with the employee, and we have some reports that can help you track those things. Whereas with an EFT, so if I hit generate ACH, choose my bank account and generate. When you do generate this file, let's say, hey, you lost it or you didn't save it, there's no worry with that, and you will see this updates to be paid. If you do lose that file or you saved it or you misplaced it or something like that, it is always available to you under this tax filing and payment area, which allows us to re-download the same file that you generated right here. And you can see that it was created on 12/8, and this is our pay date that we were just looking at as well. Okay, so from there, the way that you would then communicate out to your ERP or financial system, depending on what you're connected to. We can provide background on really any and all of the different batches, or I'm sorry, different systems that Criterion does connect to currently. But what you would do is you would download or transmit in the case of utilizing another system for the financial records. You'd have the ability to download your general ledger entry. This first click right here will open up a summary for us of the payroll batch and the entries themselves, whereas there will also be a transmit button to then send that over into whether it's Sage 300, whether it's Intact or any of the other major ERP systems that you may connect to that we would have set up. Those can be set up and mapped out for you by the Criterion and BAASS team, as Nancy mentioned, with across both organizations, a great development team for Criterion to develop the GL, for BAASS to develop the general ledger, which would then go smoothly into your financial system for reconciliation and accounting purposes of those expenses from payroll. And then I did see a few questions come through here. So we'll throw it back to our PowerPoint for those questions.
Connor, I think you're on the path to this earlier. I'm not sure if you're able to show the manager's view of the scheduled time and the actual time.
Yes, just give me one moment. I'm going to pull that up.
Okay, thanks.
And we'll address those other questions if you want right
now. And I think There was a question on controlling employee punches and corrections to punches.
Yes, so that's a good question as well. And the answer to that, I think Nancy would have covered a little bit in our introductory portion of how we're gathering time. So the way that we can control how an employee punches is a number of different areas. So we've talked a little bit about the mobile app where we can control the geofence, whether or not they're in or outside of the geofence. One thing in there as well is that you can actually control whether or not you want to accept a punch outside of a geofence and just notate that it was outside of the geofence. So that's one area. We also have the ability to limit what an employee can edit from the My Timesheet view versus the Team Timesheet view. So team timesheets allow for a manager or a system administrator to actually go in and make changes to punches. Whereas if on the timesheet within Criterion, you limit it to just a button entry, meaning in or out, an employee with access to just My Timesheet would not be able to make changes to that. They wouldn't be able to edit their punches from My Timesheets. They would have to communicate that to the manager, and the manager could then go into team timesheets where they could edit or change any punch that the employee had made.
That's great. I think though we've probably run over our time allotment. We have the other session starting in a couple of minutes. So Haley, do you think we should wrap it up?
I think that's a great idea. Thank you, Connor, so much for presenting. Thank you, Nancy, for your help with those questions and that information at the beginning.